Is the microphone on? Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to Basecamp tonight. And what a great evening, what a great guest we have here later on. Great discussion we're going to have here at Basecamp. Now, I do see a lot of familiar faces here in the crowd. This is not my first time hosting, so I do recognize most of you, some of you at least. But for those who are here for the very first time in Basecamp, let me just tell you that this place has really established itself as perhaps the most important base, platform, and meeting point for Berlin's thriving digital community. It features opinion leaders from the digital world on a regular basis, and tonight is no exception. Quite the contrary, because Basecamp, which is featuring a lot of series and formats, has just introduced a new one, Digital Masterminds at Basecamp. Tonight is the premiere, Digital Mastermind, and Andrew Keen, no pressure there, Masterminds. We're going to see how much of that plays out at the end on stage. Sounds a bit like a James Bond villain, doesn't it? Mastermind. But we'll see how much of it is true, how much of it justified, because the gentleman I am very pleased and honored to have on stage here in just a moment. He is quite a figure. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say he is one of the best known and most controversial commentators on Silicon Valley today. It's not without a reason that people call him the Antichrist of Silicon Valley. And I know he takes pride. I suppose he takes pride in that title. And how much of that is actually justified, we'll see in just a bit. So this gentleman, let me just say a few things. To read out his entire biography would take up most of the evening. But just a few pointers. He is the executive director of the Silicon Valley-based event series Futurecast, which I'm sure is a cool thing, but not as cool as Digital Masterminds. He hosts his own internet chat show, Keen On. For those who haven't tuned in yet, do it. I can highly recommend it, Keen On. And he is a columnist for CNN, and perhaps the one he takes most pride in, GQ magazine, has just recently featured and named him on its 100 most connected men's list. I think quite an accomplishment. He's the author of 3 books. Cult of the Amateur was the first, Digital Vertigo the second, and of course his most current, the international bestseller, the one that we're going to discuss here tonight in detail, The Internet is Not the Answer. The Internet is not the answer, says Andrew Keen in his latest book. I'm very happy to debate him on it and of course take your input with the Q&A later on. Everyone, please welcome Andrew Keen. Yeah. Andrew, welcome. We had a chat before this event. I'm quite impressed. This gentleman just flew in from San Francisco today. I look more tired than you do, but I think that that just comes with the fact of...
Well, I'm the Antichrist, so we can do special things.
I guess. And you're the mastermind, remember. So welcome to Berlin. Great to have you.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's the free beer, though, I suspect.
Yeah, I hope you didn't have too much of it now. Later on, we'll celebrate a great discussion, I'm sure. But Andrew Keen, in Berlin, and as I said, your book, the most recent one, we see it here also on display. You'll be signing it later on. The Internet is not the answer. Obviously.
Yeah, in German that has a different title.
Well, we changed the names of movie titles too, and then they sound a bit crazy. Like
what's the title in German?
What's the title in German? Das digitale Debakel. Okay. Can you say it? Say it.
Digital Debakel.
Yeah. Well, not bad for a British person. Okay.
No, it definitely brings out the complexity of the title. Yeah.
Yeah. Well. We Germans like complexity, so in that sense, we brought it together.
Although my first book was called, in the US, UK, it was called The Cult of the Amateur, and in Germany it got translated as something Der Stumper. And I always could get a laugh. It didn't sell because wasn't an accurate translation, but...
So. Well, hopefully, I mean, I know that this book is selling quite well in Germany, despite its title. It's selling quite well.
Well, maybe because of its title, I would guess. I mean, well, you like debacles here, right?
Well, that too coming from a British person, but that's a different story. We could talk about football too, and then you be up losing on the other end. But let's focus on your book. The internet is not the answer. For all intents and purposes, let's stick with the English title tonight.
Yeah.
And of course, it is a provocative title, no doubt. It's a catchy one, but it's a provocative one. And you lay out a lot of points in your book, and some of which I'm happy to address tonight. Now, before we get on, I think it's before we get down to the nuts and bolts, perhaps you can tell us, who is this internet? Who is this internet that you speak of? You say the internet is not the answer, but at the end of the day, includes so many things. What do you mean by the internet?
Well, that's actually a really good question. And I think it's one of the weaknesses with the title, the English title of the book, is the internet as a word now has become rather archaic. When we think about the internet, we think of pipes, we think of connectivity, we think of smartphones. But when I'm using the word the internet, I'm talking about something broader and deeper. I'm talking about the digital revolution, the network revolution, the thing that's changing the world, the network. So I'm using the internet in the same way as we once used the term industrialization or industry. And I think the book is about this great shift from an industrial society, a top-down hierarchical society, to a network society. And so when I'm talking about the internet, I'm talking about stuff that we wouldn't necessarily normally associate with computers. And even the word computer now, I think, has become archaic. I'm talking about connected cars, connected homes. I'm talking about, obviously, mobile devices. I'm talking about devices that may be shrunk down into eyeglasses or devices that will be sewn into clothing. I'm talking about a technological revolution that changes everything. Ericsson, the telco provider, says, and I think Cisco said the same thing, that there'll be 50 billion connected devices by 2020. So the phrase now people use is the Internet of Things. I like the things bit. I'm not sure about the internet, because we're talking about a world of ubiquitous connectivity, a world where every industry, from transportation to healthcare to hospitality, is being changed by technology.
And let's break down some of the arguments, because you do make some, rather provocative ones. And one I want to shout out here is, and not to pull any punches, the internet, says Andrew Keen, has been mostly a disaster for almost everyone, except a tiny group of young, privileged, white Silicon Valley billionaires. Okay, now, before we get to that, I'm just curious, because I know we have a knowledgeable crowd here in the audience, and maybe we do a little bit of the before and after, so maybe you can persuade some of the people throughout the way. But for now, who here really thinks that the internet has been mostly a disaster? Can I see a show of hands? Can I see? One person. Wow, you got the work cut out for yourself.
Well, I can't lose.
Come on. Well, here's the thing. That's good, because I know you're a man who likes a challenge. So within the next 60 to 90 minutes, you have a lot of people to persuade here.
But let me add the caveat here, and it's always important to do that, and I do it in the book too. I am not saying that the internet is a complete disaster in every sense. I acknowledge in the book that I couldn't have written my book without the internet. I acknowledge that it's changing everything, some of it for the better. The point of my book, the point of the digital debacle, the internet is not the answer, is to argue that on its own terms, I tell the history of the internet. I tell the history of its foundation and the history over almost the last 50 years. And it's all, on its own terms, it hasn't been a success. It was supposed to have been a revolution that democratized, that created more opportunity, that shared wealth, that made the world a fairer and culturally richer place. And my conclusion is that so far it hasn't. So I'm analyzing the internet and the digital revolution on its own terms, in its own language.
And let's look at the language. The internet, says Andrew Keen, has widened inequality. It hasn't narrowed the gap, quite on the contrary. It has widened the gap between the rich and poor. And without government regulation, he says, internet will impoverish us all in the long run. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, what I say.
Well then, next to the question, let's... No, but I mean, look, you say it's...
The point, Kevin Kelly, for example, who's a well-known Silicon Valley evangelist, wrote a book in 1995 called The New Rules of the New Economy, in which he said that there were these laws, these basic laws of the digital world, which would lend themselves to being more companies, more competition, more opportunity. Chris Anderson, another of the cheerleaders of Silicon Valley, wrote a book called The Long Tail, another very successful book in about 2006, in which he said there was this long tail in which many cultural producers would share in the prosperity of the digital revolution. But what I see, looking very critically at the digital economy, is not sharing, is not more economic democracy. What I see is a winner-take-all economy. I don't even see two dominant companies in most sectors. So Google, for example, is the quintessential winner-take-all company. Uber is a $40 billion gamble to become the monopolistic platform for network transportation. Airbnb is the same in hospitality. So this isn't because the internet is bad. It's not because Silicon Valley people are evil. The laws, though, of this winner-take-all economy lend themselves to monopoly. And what we're seeing in the new digital economy is not more opportunity, but less opportunity. And what we see is an enormous concentration of wealth with your Facebooks and your Googles and your WhatsApps and your Instagrams. It's like entering the lottery. Someone will stick up their hand and say, oh, I knew someone who had a success as an entrepreneur. And there are always examples. But that's like saying, well, I won the lottery, you have a chance to win the lottery. And the Silicon Valley economy is a lottery, and there are very few winners.
But let's be honest, I mean, monopolies obviously is not something that the internet created. It's not a new phenomenon.
No, but
You've had monopolies.
You can't put it in those terms. The internet, I think it's wrong to have a sentence saying the internet created. The internet is not the determining thing. The internet is not a person. What we're talking about is a general change in the nature of economics and society. And the digital revolution is creating conditions which lend themselves towards monopoly. So you could say, well, the Industrial Revolution didn't create the early monopolies of the 19th century, but nonetheless, the laws of that industrial society and the laws of digital society creating the conditions. So there's no Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page sitting in a dark room in Silicon Valley controlling this thing. It's the laws of this new economy, which is what I'm pointing out in my book.
And the laws need to be changed, you say, more government
regulation? Well, there's laws and laws. There's laws determining the nature of the economy, and there are political laws, and you need political laws to control monopoly, as you've always had done in history. But the laws that I'm talking about in terms of determining monopoly are not written by legislators. They're not authored in Berlin or Washington, D.C. or Brussels. These are laws written into the structure of this new economy.
And we'll talk more about those laws and how they ought to be implemented in just a little bit. But again, the sharing economy you mentioned. You say the sharing economy is actually not sharing at all. It doesn't have a sharing spirit. Quite on the contrary, it is run by selfish and unethical entrepreneurs, such as Uber CEO Travis Kalanick, a man you obviously love. I can tell, throughout the book, his name comes up quite a bit. You love him. And here's the point that I want to ask you about, though. Greed. I mean, you say these people are greedy, they're egotistic, and they're narcissistic. To which I would say, well, just like in any other industry then, no?
Right, and I'm not saying otherwise. I mean, there's a European social theorist called Jeremy Rifkin. Some of you may have heard of him. He talks about the sharing economy as a post-capitalist economy. I'm simply pointing out that there's nothing much sharing about the sharing economy. What it's doing are creating these new, highly leveraged, financed platforms that are financed by Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And they're not about sharing. The language, it's like the language of Google. Google claims to be sharing information. Google, though, is a business premised on advertising. Google is not a public service. Uber isn't a public service. Airbnb aren't public services. And they have cleverly used the marketing language to present themselves as public services when they're anything but. They're remarkably profitable.
Yeah, but I mean, what's wrong with being profitable?
There's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with being profitable. And I don't make the point. I'm not against profitability or the market. I'm simply pointing out that the internet that was embraced as a new economic model that would do away with the old laws has actually done the reverse. It's actually compounded the old laws. It's created more inequality. It's undermined employment. It's created conditions in the economy which are creepy. It's created a surveillance economy. None of these things are new. You had the Stasi before. You had inequality before. You've had unemployment before. But what we have with the internet is the compounding of these things in ways that creep a lot of people out and disturb a lot of people. Now, it doesn't mean that without the internet you wouldn't have inequality. It doesn't mean without the internet you wouldn't have unemployment. It doesn't mean without the internet you wouldn't have surveillance. But the internet is compounding these things, or the digital economy is compounding these things.
Okay, so perhaps some of these figures you talked about and the lofty goals they set forth are maybe have been exposed as hypocritical. But my question would be, why should we expect that part, namely the digital elite, to be more altruistic, say, than in any other economic elite bracket? Why the double standard? Why do you expect them to be more
Because they
altruistic?
claim to be. I mean, I'm playing with their language. They're the ones. You know, Mark Zuckerberg talks about internet.org as bringing connectivity to the developing world. Google presents itself, as I said, as a public utility. Amazon talks about providing everything from the point of view of the consumer. So I'm simply criticizing them in terms of their own language. I'm not holding them to higher standards. And I think your critique, in a sense, is right. I'm simply saying that these are people who aren't, and the economy isn't that different from the old economy. It's not that different from certainly from the 19th century economy, which is why the book is so historical, which it goes back to the 19th century, reminds people of the challenges of the early part of the industrial age, and they didn't get resolved by the market. That's the key argument I make in the book, is it's assumed in Silicon Valley that the market can resolve all these problems. The market's created these companies are good, and they'll resolve all these kinks in the marketplace. They'll resolve all the problems. And actually, the market is actually compounding those problems of inequality, of unemployment and surveillance, which is why we need political solutions to a lot of them.
So inequality, we talked about inequality, how the internet is widening, or rather promoting inequality, and is widening the gap between the rich and poor. Another thing you just mentioned, unemployment. Let's look at that a little bit more closely then. Okay, you mentioned companies like WeChat or WhatsApp worth billions of dollars who employ maybe 50, 60 people. So they are destroying jobs, not creating ones, despite rising profits. But at the same time, there are also a number of people, I don't know how many of them are here in the audience today, who are, for whom the internet has opened up opportunities, job opportunities. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I mean, there'll always be someone stick up their hand and say, I'm an app developer, or I have this startup, and I've created this amount of jobs. It's true that the internet has created some jobs, but the amount of jobs being destroyed by the digital revolution and the amount being created by the digital revolution aren't equivalent. In the book, I have back-to-back chapters, one on Instagram and one on Kodak. Kodak being the quintessential industrial company, the leading photography company, a monopolist in its own day. It employed 145,000 people in Rochester, New York. It went bankrupt a couple of years ago. The entire heart of the city was was torn out, and almost all those 145,000 people lost their jobs. In a sense, excuse me, Kodak was replaced by Instagram, or at least the Kodak moment was replaced by the Instagram moment. When Instagram sold to Facebook for $1 billion, it employed 15 people, 1-5. Now, how can you have a company that employs so few people being so valuable? Because we're doing the work. In this new economy, we have what I call in the book data factories. But we're all working for free. In the old industrial age, Kodak paid people to work in their factories. Kodak paid people to develop their film. Kodak acquired product, which was then sold through retail channels. In the Instagram world, we are all freely and willingly creating Instagram's product. The value of Instagram wasn't based on those 15 technologists, wasn't even based on its platform. It was based on the number of photographs that were being shared. And the problem, of course, is that in a sense we're being exploited, although many of us know it. But the darker side of it is not only we're being exploited on Instagram, but we're being packaged up as the product. Because for Instagram to make money, if the content's free, if the platform's free, the only way they can make money is essentially by acquiring our data and building an advertising company, which is what they've done. So not only are we giving out our labor for free, and in that sense, arguably being exploited, but we are clearly being exploited in this new data economy, which is premised on surveillance. So the dominant business model on the internet is surveillance. Now that, I think, is deeply troubling, and I know in Germany it's particularly troubling given your history and cultural sensitivities.
And the surveillance aspect obviously has been heightened ever since the NSA crisis, which we've been having here in Germany vis-à-vis the United States.
But it existed before. I mean, the NSA crisis brought to light the problems of government. But I've been writing about this for a while. I've been arguing that the free economy doesn't work. It's not just the NSA. It's Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these other companies are essentially creating an economy where we are the product, where we are being exploited. I write about it in some detail in this book, but I also wrote about it in my last book, Digital Vertigo, which came out a year before the NSA scandal, so was perhaps a little early. But the fact is that this free economy doesn't work. For consumers to be truly satisfied, they need to pay for something, and we need much more equitable and concrete economic transactions between the companies and the consumers. Because at the moment, we're all being made to look fools.
Before I get into more detail about the surveillance point, because it is an important one, I do want to get back to the analogy that you laid out in your book about Instagram killing, sort of, as a metaphorically speaking, killing Kodak. Now, couldn't we just make the argument that that's progression? I mean, at the end...
yeah, we can.
You know,
we know.
CD killed vinyl. The video killed the radio star. What the song was, I don't know what that was. I mean, DVD killed the VHS player. At the end of the day, that's the nature of the beast.
The nature of the beast, and down the road, Joseph Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, made a career out of writing about this. The nature of capitalism is one of creative destruction. No company has any right to live forever. Telefónica at some point in the future, they may not like to hear it, will be replaced by another company. Every company gets replaced by someone else.
Disregard that.
But the telco industry eventually will be replaced by something else, just as the photography industry. But the problem is that economists have always assumed that in this creative destruction, that every new wave would create more jobs, and that every new wave would establish a kind of more, not necessarily a more equitable, but an equally equitable distribution of wealth. And that's not what's happening.
But I mean, Kodak, if I may jump in, Kodak was no benign charity. I mean, Kodak was a company that wanted to make profits, no?
Yeah, no one would say otherwise. Not only was it not a benign charity, but it was a dumb benign charity. It was a dumb company too. They were the ones who invented the digital camera in the first place. So when I write about Kodak, I'm not saying that Kodak has a right to live forever. I'm not idealizing Kodak, but I'm simply pointing out that if we sit back and say every wave of company gets replaced by another, we become determinists. We need to be critical. We need to understand that the digital vortex that we're falling into is very troubling on lots of fronts. and that many economists are worried, especially with artificial intelligence, that there simply aren't going to be jobs, that we're going to see the decimation of middle management. We're going to see even the undermining of skilled jobs. There's an artificial intelligence expert called Hans Moravich who's come up with something called the Moravich paradox, which argues that it's actually much harder for computers to replicate simple jobs like making tea or sweeping the floor, but it's easy for computers to replicate network computers, to replicate the work of lawyers or doctors or teachers. So what we're on the brink of is a crisis of the old middle class, a crisis of the old meritocracy. We're certainly in the midst of a crisis of middle management, of customer service agents, and these are real things. And where are the jobs going to be? Everyone says, well, they're up here, but it's like waiting for a bus. Sometimes after a while, they just never come.
But isn't each...
I'm from London, so you can...
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell. But no, I mean, isn't each economic revolution, if you will, even the industrial one at that, isn't it always accompanied with doomsday scenarios that this is the end of it? And then, of course, human beings rise up and they find a way to accommodate.
So we're in Berlin. Let's talk about the last time someone had a doomsday scenario about a big technological revolution. In the middle of the 19th century, Marx warned that the Industrial Revolution, well, he both warned and promised. So he warned that it would decimate the working class, that it was putting more and more people children into factories, that it was destroying cities through pollution, that it was creating profound injustice. He also was an optimist, and he believed that the revolution would free us all and allow us to live in a kind of ideal world. But Marx, in part, was right. He wasn't the only person to be making that criticism. Those are early criticisms of the Industrial Revolution, of economic inequality, of pollution, of working conditions, were correct, of the irresponsibility of the rubber baron class. And it took a generation or two of political struggle to work those things out. They're not naturally solved. And this idea that we don't need to do anything and we just sit back and let technology play itself out, and all we do is sit back and let Silicon Valley take responsibility, if that's the case, then you're going to have Ubers and Airbnbs and Googles, but you're not going to have any justice. You're not going to have the resolution of the problems that I lay out.
And surveillance, as you pointed out before, big issue. I think everyone understands that. I think everyone in the audience understands that. Here in Germany, we have a very lively and engaging debate, I believe, about privacy. And I think in Germany and Europe in general, you live out in San Francisco, I think we have a much different understanding of what...
Well, but it's, I was at MIT last week. I did an event where I was honored. Tim Berners-Lee came. We all know Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in 1989. But the guy who put the event on was someone called Ethan Zuckerman, not Zuckerberg, Ethan Zuckerman. He's a well-known technology writer and thinker. He runs the he runs the Civic Media Center at MIT. And over the last 10 or 15 years, we've been very critical of each other because I've always been a critic, and he's always been telling me I'm wrong and all the rest of it. But last year, he wrote a famous piece, a blog, saying that surveillance, the so-called free economics of the web, was the original sin of the internet. And he uses that language carefully. It's a biblical sin, of course. Original sin means everything else gets corrupted. And I saw him last week, and he acknowledged that I was right about many of these criticisms, and that surveillance is written in to the very fabric now of this economy. Because when something is free, of course, we know, the beer is in a sense free here, but it's not really free. Telefónica have marketing goals here. Nothing is ever free. And the point about the so-called free economy is it's not free. Our data, we are the ones being exploited. And we're on the brink of something of enormous change. We think we're living in a data-infested economy now. Wait 5 or 10 years when all our vehicles will be connected. Wait till smart cities. Wait till chips are sewn into our clothing. Wait till the medical revolution changes everything, so we'll all be wearing these devices that eliminate the boundary between the internal and the external world. Wait till not that there's 50 billion intelligent devices in 2020, but, 100 billion or a billion by 2030 or 35. So we're on the brink of some enormous change, a change that hitherto has been unimaginable in the history of human society.
And in order for that doomsday scenario that you laid out...
Well, it's not a doomsday... No, let's be clear here. I'm not laying out a doomsday scenario. I'm not a dystopian. I'm a critic. One of the problems we've fallen into, particularly in America, is anyone who criticizes technology is seen as writing a doomsday scenario. Anyone who's critical of technology is seen as a Luddite, as a curmudgeon. We live in a religion of optimism, and anyone who in any way steps away from the correct line is considered almost immoral. One can be critical without being dystopian. One can be critical without being reactionary. The title of my book in English is The Internet's Not the Answer. I believe it has to be the answer. We can't go back. In part, it is the answer, but had I written a title called The Internet's Half the Answer, I wouldn't be here now. And had it coming out in German, the 50% debacle or something. But the reality is we have to be critical of this thing.
But it would have been a good marketing ploy.
But we have fallen into, I think, one of the cultural problems, particularly in America, is that people are very awkward. They're uncomfortable about discussing this stuff. It's as if technology has become a kind of religion, and people like myself are heretics, when all we're doing is pointing out things which are self-evident.
Now, you are an Englishman living in San Francisco, and all those companies that you mentioned critically, obviously Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they have one thing in common. They are based and founded by Americans. Is that an American problem, if you will? Is that an American phenomenon? Or?
I think that's wrong. I mean, Google was founded by a Russian immigrant. One of the founders of Google was a Russian immigrant.
He's not an American citizen.
Well, yeah, but I think one of the founders of Airbnb is another Russian immigrant. I think one of the nice things.
So it's a Russian problem then.
Well, I think one of the nice things about Silicon Valley is it's extremely open. It's a place where it doesn't mean you go there and you immediately become a billionaire, but it is a relatively inclusive place. And people often ask me, "Oh, how do you get away with it? How do you? How is it that you're not assassinated? How is it that you're still walking around?" And the reality is that many people in Silicon Valley are actually sympathetic to my arguments. I think there's been a shift. I wrote this book, Cult of the Amateur, in 2007. That's when I got the Antichrist title. But today, I think there's increasing recognition amongst more and more technologists that there's a big problem. And in the book, I make a real effort to quote people who have historically been on the other side. I quote Fred Wilson, for example, probably the most successful and influential New York venture capitalist who worries about monopolies. I quote Mike Moritz, who's extremely well-known West Coast venture capitalist, the first investor in Google and Yahoo, who talks about data factories and their ubiquity. I quote Mark Andreessen, who worries about new networks like Secret and their impact on bullying. So I think it's important to escape. I mean, it may not always sell books or events like this, but it's important to escape the Manichaean nature of this discussion and recognize that more and more people in Silicon Valley recognize that the revolution has gone wrong, that there's a problem. Think of it perhaps in terms of the history of communism. Think about the number of people on the left who, after a while, recognized that the history of communism was a failure and that it didn't realize its goals. And in some ways, a similar thing is happening in Silicon Valley. And there are a lot of really smart people, and a lot of quite moral people, and there are also people like Travis Kalanick, who may be smart, but certainly aren't moral.
The revolution has gone wrong, says Andrew Keen. And before I bring on a third person here on the stage, quite some number, and we'll talk more about this later on. The internet he says, does not liberate, inform, or empower people. I won't ask you about the Arab Spring. I know what happened last time I asked you that. You say the internet is promoting racism, sexism, bullying, and has sparked this selfish...
Yeah, I wouldn't say... I don't think I use that word promote. What I would say is that the internet is lending itself...
Or is conducive.
Yeah, is creating a cultural world of... not of a global consciousness, but increasingly a narrow consciousness. It's become an echo chamber. We talk to one another. We're increasingly intolerant on it. And of course, ultimately, it's reduced into what I call the selfie economy, an obsession with ourselves. Just as the sharing economy isn't about sharing, the social economy isn't about the social. Social media is actually about the self. It's personalized. It's fragmented. And indeed, and I quote some studies here, the more we use Facebook, the more we use social media, the more isolated, alienated, and lonely we are.
Well, clearly, you and I are not done yet. There are still more to discuss, but I'm very happy now to bring on a third person now to the stage. And you've already mentioned Telefónica, that Telefónica might not be around forever. That is what Andrew Keen says. Quite a great place to say that, by the way. But I, of course, want to give a person from Telefónica a chance to respond and lighten up the discussion. So for that, please welcome everyone, the Managing Director Consumer at Telefónica Germany. Everyone welcome Peter Rampling. Yeah. Let's bring you in, Peter. Let's be very cozy now. You had a front row seat, so yeah. you had a good opportunity to listen to everything that Andrew's been saying up until now. What's your take? How much of it do you agree with?
Well, the first thing is, when I get back to the office, I'm going to check my employment contract, because obviously Telefónica is not going to be around for too long, so I need to think about that. But it's interesting, because there's a lot of things that Andrew says that I agree with, but maybe for different reasons. It's fascinating when you think about what he's saying about Silicon Valley, because I think we've all been there in terms of them being held up as everything that's good and great. But actually, Andrew is a challenging character who's challenging the thought process. And I think we should go with that. Because when I think of it as a consumer, and when I think of it as someone like me who works for a big corporate, I have some issues with it. You know, you might be surprised to know, from a big corporate, I do not believe in monopolies. I think monopolies are a bad thing, and they stifle innovation, and we should stop letting monopolies get bigger and stronger, because it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that's what Andrew is saying, and that's what we've seen. And what's been happening there? Well, you've got people who come up with a great idea, and then they just take with it and run it with it. They're doing horizontal integration, they're doing vertical integration, and it's starting off a kind of mindset which is, it's bizarre, because Andrew was talking about the Industrial Revolution. I think it goes back even further, because we're coming up with a mindset which is almost goes back to the feudal days. He talks about the robber barons who are running the Industrial Revolution, and I'm thinking about the Lord of the Castle. He used to say to all his serfs, if you stay with me, that's okay. You can do everything, I'll look after you, and I'll give you a good time. Don't go anywhere else, though. And that's kind of the model we're getting. And when I think of it with my corporate hat on, you know, we're in fixed telephony and mobile telephony. And what do we like? We don't like things like monopolies in device provision. We don't like monopolies in terms of operating systems. And why don't we like that? Well, because it stimulates, it reduces innovation, but actually it also stops competition. So as an operator, we'd like to see more competition. And why do we want to see more competition? Well, because once you start getting caught in those infrastructures, then your ability to move is very different. If I put aside my corporate hat and just think about it as an individual, what are the things that really annoy me in today's... Because I think the digital debacle is actually quite a good way of putting it, rather than internet per se, because it's bigger than the internet. When I think about my digital life, you know, what's really important to me and what's important to lots of people here? You know, it's the relationships you've got, it's your content, it's your music, it's your photos, it's your communication. Why is it that we can't move that stuff around? It gets locked into monopolies. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Android or iOS, they're almost monopolies. And moving stuff around is getting harder and harder. I don't personally think that's a good thing. I think we should be able to move our stuff around freely. With my corporate hat on, the analogy is, if I as a network operator said, do you know what, I'm not going to let you communicate with other networks. That'd be crazy, wouldn't it? What? So I'm a customer of you, Peter, at Telefónica, but I can't ring that customer who's a friend of mine who uses Vodafone. That would be the feudal. I'd be like the Lord of the Manor saying, stick with O2, stick with E+, we'll look after you, we'll connect your calls, we'll give you great value. Don't ring anyone else. How crazy would that be? But that's the world of a Silicon Valley monopoly gone crazy that we'll end up with if we're not careful. And how do we get into this situation? Well, I've already said I don't believe in monopolies. Another thing you might be surprised to hear from a big corporate is, actually, I believe in regulation. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, well, maybe 27, 28 years ago when I started off in telecoms, I'd have said, oh, the regulator in the UK, where it was, he's crazy, he's trying to stop us being creative. But actually, what he was doing was very, very clear. He was stimulating competition. And again, we're in this crazy situation where operators, and it doesn't matter whether it's me or AT&T or someone else, we operate under regulation that stimulates competition. But actually, we then compete with people who operate the same kind of stuff, but have none of that regulation. So you don't want to hear me crying about how much investment we have to put into the network to make sure the data service is great. And you'll be really pleased to hear about the national roaming we're going to have between O2 and E+, so the 3G service gets better and better this week. But at the end of the day, there's this huge investment that we put in. We're regulated, so we maintain openness. But actually, lots of the Silicon Valley operations become monopolies that don't operate under the same rules. And therefore, I think that ultimately stifles our creativity because there's no investment.
So clearly commonality here, Andrew, that I'm hearing, regulation, pro-regulation, both of you. Are you talking about the same kind of regulation?
Well, I think, I don't know if Peter's referring, there's a book out, some of you may have read it, by a guy called Peter Thiel, who is a libertarian, very successful entrepreneur and investor, and he says that monopolies are good, and that we should aspire almost to monopolies in society. And I think Peter's absolutely right. I don't think monopolies are good for society.
This Peter, not Peter Thiel.
Yeah, our Peter rather than the other Peter.
Just clarifying.
And I think it's wrong. I think monopolies make us lazy. They make us corrupt. They don't enable high-quality products. And I think for the last 25 years, or the last 20 years, we've had a burst, an explosion of innovation in Silicon Valley. And you need to think to yourself, why did that happen? Because back in '95, there wasn't a lot of innovation. Back in '95, there was essentially, in tech, there was one monopolist, and we know who that monopolist was. It was Microsoft. And any time anyone tried to do anything interesting, Microsoft crushed it. So, for example, when Netscape came out with their original browser, Microsoft tried to crush it. They came out with their IE browser. But then the EU and finally the US came to their senses and recognized that that was against innovation. And the reason why we had the burst of energy in Silicon Valley, the reason why we had Web 2.0, the reason why we had Google was because of the antitrust case against Microsoft. Monopolies aren't good for innovation. And in a funny way, we've come the full circle now. Think about how powerful, for example, Google is. That was a Freudian area of Google is, across sectors. Not only in search, but in mapping, in video, in Android. Peter, I think, laid out a very good case for why these sort of walled garden platforms like Android aren't good for consumers. But we're in a similar situation where the EU in particular is beginning to look quite critically at antitrust. And we're in a new stage. Politics is all important. And to protect innovation, we need regulation. All too often in America, people assume that regulation and innovation are enemies. They're actually friends. You only maintain innovation in a regulatory economy. That doesn't mean everything should be regulated. That doesn't mean you regulate for no reason. But when you have these monopolists, certainly like Google, perhaps like Amazon, we need regulation to maintain competitiveness. And indeed, in Europe, we were talking at dinner today about Berlin. It's a great place. I love coming here. But how many really innovative companies have come out of Berlin? How much innovation is really coming out of Europe? And one of the reasons why there isn't much innovation is because of this monopolistic situation. 90% of the search market in Southern Europe is controlled by Google. So to get innovation, we need to think or rethink a lot of public policy.
Peter, we are more or less blind to the internet's dangers, says Andrew. We're taking in the good, we're enjoying it without seeing that we're paying a heavy price for it. Is that also your sentiment? Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think Andrew set the record straight at the start, which is clearly when you say the internet is bad, you can't agree with that. It's not that the internet is bad, it's just some of the activities and behaviors aren't great. I think some of my worries, again, on a personal level, are around my data on the internet. Again, shock horror. Someone who works for a mobile phone company, I'm not a great social media person because I don't want to share my data with lots of different people. I'm worried about people's privacy. I'm worried what's happening with that data. I'm worried what people are doing with it. And I think for everyone, and this isn't just about Germany, where we're even more worried about data protection than probably any other country in the world, I think there's a part about saying that we need to change the agenda around because we're having a conversation about cars, and Andrew was talking about the connected cars. All the cars are going to be connected. When you buy a car in 5-10 years' time, if it hasn't got a Wi-Fi hotspot in board. I mean, it'd just be unbelievable to think of that in 5 years' time, that it won't come with connectivity. They will all have connectivity. But what actually happens with the data? Who owns the data? My view as a consumer is, it's my data. I'm driving the car, I bought the car, what I do and where I go and what I consume when I'm in the car and what I do and how well I drive or how badly I drive, that's my data. It doesn't belong to the manufacturer, it doesn't belong to the telco, it doesn't belong to anyone apart from me. And I think that's one of the things that we need to think about as we go down on the journey on the internet, because there's so many people who are actually taking ownership of individuals' data. And that's got to be addressed at some point. And it's going to become even more apparent when you get to the 50 billion connected devices that Andrews talks about.
Yeah, my point isn't that we should trust Peter or Telefónica any more than we should trust Larry Page and Google. It's not morality. It's not that some companies are better or worse. It's about business model. So Peter's business model is selling connectivity. We pay whatever you pay to have a Telefónica account. There is a clear financial exchange. The problem is that financial exchange doesn't exist amongst most dominant internet companies. So Google, whatever its morality, whether they're good or evil, I don't think those words are really very useful. Rather, Google is dependent on our data to make money. Because if they don't mine the data, if they don't exploit the data, they don't have a business model. Telefónica has, like a car company, like restaurants, they have a business model where they make things, they have a valuable service or a product, which they sell. And I fear that that's the arena. It's not just me, it's Zuckerman, it's many other people, that's the fundamental problem with our digital economies. We've made a cardinal error, and eventually it will explode. And I think actually, I've heard there's some entrepreneurs here, that's where the real entrepreneurial opportunity lies. Google's a very open company. They buy my books, they have me in to speak to their senior people. And I was in their London office last month, and someone stuck up their hand and said, "What's our biggest problem? What should we fear?" I said, "You fear your own business model, because in 40 years or 30 years, it won't exist. You need to reinvent your own businesses."
And how would you change it? And perhaps a question to both of you. You criticize the business model on the part of Google and all these companies. If somebody would say, okay, Andrew, you convinced us...
Well, let Peter go first, since he's the businessman here.
That's very convenient. But Peter, I'll throw that one at you first.
I mean, I think the...
First of all, do you agree with the premise that the business model is flawed?
I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect business model. I think no business, no company has the right to existence, and companies will evolve. I was in the UK when we got floated out of BT, and we were O2 started off in the UK, and every month we were reminding ourselves we do not have the right to existence. We paid a lot of money for a spectrum, we've got a lot of investment, we've got a big network, but we do not have the right to exist. And that's true. It doesn't matter how big or how diverse the company is. And there's lots of examples of other companies disappearing other than Kodak. So firstly, you don't have the right to exist. If you don't have the right to exist, then what you should take is the right to evolve your business product and your value chain. If you're not prepared to change it and challenge it, then you will become a dinosaur and you will die. That's a classic problem for us as a telco. You know, we've got loads and loads. I mean, if I think back to when I started off in telecoms, it was very clear who our competitors were. You know, and you need to know who your competitors are if you're going to be successful in business. Now, actually, the dividing line between someone who's someone we cooperate with and someone who's a competitor is actually a very thin line. You know, and there's all sorts of people who I'm dealing with, who I look at them and I do business with them, but I see as much of a competitor in their eye as I see either a customer or a supplier. And that's an interesting dynamic because it means you have to continue to question yourself and challenge what is your business model, what is the value chain you're operating in. And of course, clearly, lots of people have looked at the telecom value chain and said, I want a piece of that. And that's why we've got all sorts of challenges in terms of over-the-top players. Again, they're taking value out of the value chain that's traditionally been owned by the telcos, not making the investment, but taking a revenue source. Now, it's a double-edged sword because for telco companies, at the end of the day, we're very lucky because you, our customers, love our product. You love data. Yeah, that's great. Now, the challenge is to make sure that we can have a fair exchange in terms of that product and the usage. And how do we stimulate that? Well, what do I want to see? I mean, I'm looking around here. You're all going to be using loads and loads of data. What I'd really like to see is everyone doing loads and loads of video because then it means you'll use even more data. And therefore, I've got an opportunity to monetize it and then put all the investment back into the network to continue the business model. But that in itself isn't going to be sufficient. The way that I look at our business now is, having merged between O2 and E+, we're now the biggest mobile operator in Germany. Again, the fact that we're the biggest doesn't give us the right to be successful. It doesn't give us the right to be in existence in a number of years' time. So we've got to evolve. That then means we have to start looking at other value chains. So we're looking at other services. The previous role that I was doing before this was looking at new businesses. So we're looking at machine-to-machine applications. We're looking at financial services. We have to evolve because if we stay as a telco provider, clearly I think there's still a great business to be had. We have to continue to evolve. And I
want to add, I think every business, one of the astonishing, worrying, but also exciting things about the digital revolution is every business is being changed. And if you don't think your business is being changed, you're toast. Every business, it's not just media, it started in media, now it's in telecommunications, education, healthcare, transportation, energy, everything is being changed. All the principles, all the storm that knocked down the old media economy is now knocking down every traditional economy. Manufacturing, 3D printing is going to have a profound impact. I think one of the most interesting things in Germany, which after all is the leading manufacturing country in the world, with a leading manufacturing culture, indeed its whole economy has been shaped around manufacturing. I think one of the interesting opportunities, but also challenges for Germany over the next 25 years, is how its manufacturing economy will adapt to the democratization of manufacturing through 3D printing and other technologies, which means in some senses everyone can have a factory on their desktop. Just as 25 years ago you could have a publishing house on your desktop. We were promised back then that it would result in everyone being able to sell books and music and movies. The reality is that everyone can produce this stuff, but no one's able to sell it. And if I was a German politician or a German industrialist, I would be very worried about the impact of this revolution on the traditional German economy. There are many opportunities, but for a company whose main value, whose main employment source is in jobs in the manufacturing economy, the next wave of the digital revolution is going to be really traumatic.
Let me just pick up on a point you just made, namely everything will change inevitably. Some things get outdated and obsolete. Well, can I just then make the argument, if that's the case, and perhaps you're right, history at least tells us that it is, can we just say that at some point Google will be obsolete, something better will come along? I remember the time when Alta Vista was the best thing. Google came, killed that. I remember the time, maybe some of the young ones here not, but MySpace was the next best thing around the corner. Who still is on MySpace here? You know, MySpace is dead.
That's the Google argument.
So Facebook might be dead in 10 years.
So that's the Google argument. When they're arguing with the antitrust people in Brussels or in Berlin, that's their argument. Well, you're only one click away. You don't have to use Google, although in Europe, I don't know what else you euuse for search. The problem is, though, that Google is so strong across so many categories that it's very hard to imagine them being dislodged without some political changes. But in a sense, you're right. But that comes back to my argument about a winner-take-all economy. MySpace collapsed, and it was replaced by Facebook, which has now become the winner-take-all player. Yahoo and AOL collapsed as media companies. They've essentially been replaced by Google. The problem with this economy is it doesn't seem to invite or reward variety. It's an economy that lends itself to monopoly. And that's one of the longer-term and more structural challenges, I think, to all of us, to figure out, do we want this kind of economy where it seems as though there's only going to be one winner? Now, I'm not sure if that's the case when it comes to carriers. I know in Germany there's a number of carriers, whereas in the US there's only 4. But maybe with digitalization you will have less competition.
Peter, let's talk. I mean, if you take off your corporate hat again for a second, and I know that Andrew, of course, has been overly pessimistic, if not critical, but of course there are some
I'm
upsides.
not being pessimistic, I'm being realistic. It's not pessimism to point out self-evident truths. It's simply just being honest.
Well, here's an honest man to my left, but
I'm an honest man to your right.
You know, honest man to my right, that's good. British, always honorable gentlemen, and you two are proven to be no exception. But if we talk about the internet, you know, as consumers, you and I, take off our corporate hat, take off my journalistic hat. I mean, at the end of the day, he may malign, you know, something like Airbnb, but it's a good thing if you travel to New York or Barcelona and you find a place to stay, inexpensive. For this discussion alone, it was good for me to have the internet to read up on Andrew Keen. You know, and Andrew, by the way, it's good to have Amazon. Your book is being sold on Amazon, but that's a different issue. No, but I mean, the upsides, and I'm playing devil's advocate and being provocative, of course, aren't they worth a little bit of privacy?
Wherever there's a fair exchange, yes. You know, I'm prepared to trade certain things if I get something in return. It's where I give something and get nothing in return. That's where I don't think it's right. I mean, if you think about our lifestyle and how we do things so fundamentally differently, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about international travel and the ability to suddenly find where the best restaurants are or what the sites are that you can go and see, the fact that you don't have to unfold this great big piece of paper to find your way around the city. There's a whole lot of things that have fundamentally transformed the way that we live and work and play in just so many areas. You know, you just think about the way that we do things completely differently now. None of us would ever want to be without our mobile phone or our tablet device. You can't envisage being without that because of the connectivity to the internet that it gives you. You know, clearly, it's not just about the internet. I mean, I use my smartphone for photography as much as I do for internet. There's lots of other things that I can do with it, but absolutely. You know, would I want to go back to the world, and I'm old enough to remember when the internet wasn't there? No, of course I don't. I mean, I think I've got a couple of grown-up girls. They're 25 and 20, and I've seen them grow up through this age. The way that they've been educated has been fundamentally different, and I think better because they've had access to a huge amount of information. The fact that they're able to have done, whether they're at school, at university, to be able to do a huge amount of submission of their work online, the fact they're able to research, it's just so much better. But that said, we need to be careful. We need to be careful in terms of, is their data being protected? As a parent, I was always worried about the cyberbullying piece, and that's been a big, big issue in the UK. And we mustn't lose sight of that, because it is how we as a society want to live. Are we prepared to accept the benefits and ignore the downsides? Something like bullying, I'm sorry, no ifs, no buts. Bullying is completely unacceptable at home, at the workplace, at school, and if there's something that is facilitating that, then everyone in society must stand up and be counted and do something about it.
But is it Uber's fault? Is it Airbnb's fault? Is it Facebook's fault that we, and I include myself in it, want to have our cake and eat it too? Okay, the minute you say Facebook, you got to pay €5 a month, half of us would leave. Yeah?
So you're right. And the point that I'm making in the book is to remind people of the real costs of this. So let me talk about two kinds of costs of what we're talking about. First, you mentioned Amazon. Amazon is a wonderful company in many ways. We all use it. I joke sometimes it's like pornography. We all use it. No one ever talks about it publicly. But we do use it. It's very reliable, great pricing, wonderful interface, remembers everything we ever bought, so it always has interesting suggestions. Jeff Bezos built a cult around the consumer. He created a company, he says, a very brilliant company, he's a very brilliant man, where everything is for the consumer. So it seems like a no-brainer. You know, you can buy my book here, or you can buy it on Amazon, maybe not so much in Germany, but in the US, you can buy my book in a bookstore for $25, or you can buy the book on Amazon for $15. It's a no-brainer. Why would you ever go to a bookstore? Why would you ever bother to go down the street when you can just go on your computer and order it online? And if you have Amazon Prime, you don't even have to pay for postage. My point in the book is that we make a choice when we buy from Amazon. We make a choice in terms of its impact on retail, because I remind everyone in the book, 50% of the independent bookstores in the UK and the US have shut since Amazon's emergence in the late 90s. We make a judgment about labor conditions. Again, Germany is slightly different, because Germany, I think, has a better tradition in this and a better history, but Amazon's labor policies have been catastrophic. They're extremely exploitative. One expert labor economist even argues that they're worse than Walmart, more exploitative. I have a number of stories in my book about what it's like to work at Amazon. And finally, it's even bad for the author. You can say, well, there's always a joke where you buy. What am I going to say? You can't buy my book on Amazon? That would be insane. But it's not good for the writer, because Amazon has emerged as a monopolist, as a publisher. And last year, they got involved in a massive standoff with Hachette, one of the world's largest publishers, trying to push them around. They even treat small publishers as what they call gazelles, which are, you know, to be eaten by big beasts like Amazon. So I'm not saying we ban Amazon. I mean, maybe there's some antitrust stuff. But it comes back to this question, what do we want? Do we want a world where retail is decimated, where there are no independent bookstores? Do we want a world where people are working in these awful, inhumane conditions in Amazon distribution centers for minimum wage, where unions are not allowed? Do we want a world where Amazon is a publishing monopolist and essentially makes it harder and harder to publish interesting work? We don't want that. Most of us, I'm sure everyone here doesn't want that. So we have to make a choice. Doesn't mean we shouldn't always use Amazon, but by using Amazon, there are costs, real costs. Now, when it comes to Airbnb and Uber, what I see and why I wrote this book, and indeed the title, Why the Internet's Not the Answer, is I see a new world coming into being. A world where people are half-employed, a gig economy, where we drive in, and Marx joked in the German ideology, I don't know if he joked, he said in the German ideology that we'd be farmers in the morning and poets in the afternoon and cooks in the evening. But the reality in this world is we are cab drivers in the morning, we're renting out our homes in the afternoon, and in the evening, we're waiting in line for rich people to buy our iPhones on networks like TaskRabbit. What we're seeing in this new digital economy is a gig economy, not full employment, not unionized employment, not work which rewards or cherishes labor. And what we're seeing also is the hollowing out of the middle class. We're seeing the disappearance of that core middle-class labor that was key to democracy and, I think, to a civil kind of society. So that doesn't mean we ban Uber or Airbnb, but what we need to do is stand back and say, is this a world we want? Or should Uber be responsible for should Uber take responsibility for its drivers? Should Uber have more responsibility towards paying pension and securing the rights? And indeed, when it comes to Airbnb, the problem with Airbnb is most of the people renting out their rooms aren't paying taxes. So ultimately, it comes down to us. We can rely on government and regulation, and that's an important piece. But this new world that's coming into being is making most people uncomfortable. When you look at it, when we look on the horizon, when the mist clears, it's a world that in many ways is worse than the world it replaces. That's why I wrote my book, and it's for all of you to think, is this a world you want? And if it isn't, you have to do something, because if someone sticks up their hand and says, well, technology works in its own way, when there's nothing much we can do, then we might as well just pack up and go home. Because we are ultimately in control of our technology rather than technology being in control of us.
Well, we're not packing up and going home quite yet. Quite on the contrary. I know we have a lot of expertise here on the stage for obvious reasons, but I also know we have quite a bit of expertise here in the audience, and I do want to make use of this expertise and give you the opportunity, give you the chance to ask questions, both, of course, to Andrew Keen as well as to Peter Rampling. And the internet is not the answer. I think quite a powerful manifesto. You certainly have conveyed it with great passion. And at the end of this discussion, I will see how many people here in the audience you have persuaded. But
I only needed to persuade one to win, right? Unless the one person who was on my side changed their mind.
Wow, that's very Hollywood, but I like it. I like it. Now, let's look around. We already have the first question, and I think we have a microphone here. Let's start with the gentleman here. Yeah, we'll try to squeeze in as many as we can. My plea would be keep it short, and hopefully there'll be a question mark at the end of the sentence.
There will be. Is this okay? I got a question for Andrew Keen. I completely agree on several of your points, especially on the one that we need regulation as a solution for the problem that you described. I just wonder, how do you think those regulations would have to look like exactly? And do you think there's a chance to actually apply them globally? Because I feel that's where the actual answer to where the actual solution lies. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I could spend an hour responding to that. Let me just say a couple of things. We are seeing a breach between the US and Europe, which I think is worrying. And I think we need more work, both from Europe and the US, to work together, particularly given when it comes to the threat to the free internet, countries like Russia in particular, or Iran, China offer. So I would like to see more agreement between Europe and the US on a lot of these issues. The moment I worry that it's been nationalized, Obama made a speech saying, well, Europeans only are trying to protect their own companies, and when they're criticizing Google or Facebook, they're criticizing America. I don't think that's fair. But the second part of your question, I think, is a really important one. I think we're on the brink. We always have these conversations in internet. We're on the brink of something enormous. And just as on the Internet of Things and data economy changes everything, it's the next 2 or 3 billion people connected is going to change everything too. We are, and it's companies like Peter's company, it's the mobile web. You don't need the same kind of wired infrastructure anymore. Over the next 5 or 6 years, what is it, Peter? Next, 3, 4 more billion people are going to be on the network?
Yeah, if you look in terms of the growth rate, you're in a situation where in the last 10 years...
Well, we've got about 3 billion now, or 2.6 billion now.
Yeah, it's Total connections for mobile, it's around about, by the end of this year, will be about 3.2 billion. And
so it's about, what, 40% of...
800 million.
So it's about 40% of...
Yeah.
But what's going to... It's the next 3 billion that are going to come on really fast through cheaper and cheaper handsets, more and more connectivity. And that's where regulation, you know, Peter talks about bullying, racism, cyber warfare. Suddenly these issues are going to become way larger. And you think about the impact of the internet's had on the West, wait till it arrives in Africa. Wait till it arrives in big terms in Southeast Asia. Then I think the policy implications are going to become even more profound.
I mean, just building on Andrew's point, there's also, when you start thinking about the developed world and the emerging world, as a company, we have a thought and a belief that technology should be open to everyone. That's what we want to make sure happens. That doesn't mean to say giving away free phones to everyone, but it says enabling and trying to drive it as best as we can. The scary bit is that historically, you know, if you think about where we were in 2005, the vast majority of people who were on the internet were essentially in the developed countries. Now, in the emerging countries, they're outnumbering the people in the developed countries by a factor of 4 to 1, and that's just going to keep going.
And I fear that a lot of the things I talk about, inequality, are going to be even more compounded. So, for example, in education, now there's this cult of MOOCs, these massive online learning communities. But when the next 3 or 4 billion come online, you have classes of, you know, 2 or 3 million. I think that education on the internet is actually going to do a profound disservice to many of these people flooding on who are challenged when it comes to schools and education in their own countries.
Let's bring in some more people. I think a gentleman already has the microphone, and I'm not trying to neglect this side. If you have a question, let me know. Go ahead.
Yes, one small remark. Andrew was saying that the internet is not the answer, and I was missing a little bit Keynes, who was saying in around 85 years before that in the year 2000 we only have to work maximum 3 days per week because of the higher rate of productivity, efficiency. And the internet is always promising us that we have, well, the whole day life is easier. And if I'm looking on the times we have spent at work, it's more than 60 hours sometimes. So, well, where is the progress today? And the other thing is, you know, you are mentioning Schumpeter, but you were not mentioning Schumpeter. He was saying not only the destruction of creativity, but that capitalism will end the more we have monopolies, and maybe that will convert to socialism or other forms. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. Shall we direct it, if you want to answer now, both? I think you nodded your head when the gentleman spoke.
Well, it resonates with me because quite often, you know, it's my fault. You know, in the connected society, always on society with devices that are always there, and we can, and there is sometimes pressure in certain companies to work 24/7. And I remember having a conversation with my father. He used to be a doctor. He's retired now. And he had a model which said that the more senior he got, the less he had to work. That was the model that when he was growing up. And I said, well, actually, it's the other way around now. The more senior you become, the more hard you have to work. But there is a choice. And the choice is in terms of where and when you stay connected. Now, I make an active choice to disconnect because in so many works, and I'm sure it's the same for many of the people here, you can just keep working and working and working and working and working. I don't fundamentally believe that's a great thing for human beings. I'm 100% certain I could work 24/7 for a long time and I'd never finish my work. There'd always be more coming in. The more emails I send, the more I get. It's a spiraling piece because there's always things that I can improve, always things that I can do better. But you need to draw a line, and that's down for us all. And it's called the off button. And we've kind of forgotten that these things we're in control of the devices, we can switch them off. And that's what triggered the thought when you were talking about the changes of life and the thing is, we're not retaining the control that we've actually got. And my challenge to everyone, and whether it's you or my team members or indeed my children, is don't forget to stop at some stage, because otherwise we will all drive ourselves into a little hole in the ground, and stress will go up, and heart rates will go up, and death rates will go up, and that's not a great kind of world that I want to see. I want to see a balanced world.
Your team members have a big smile on their face. I saw them around. They're like, yeah, finally, we're getting to get off earlier. But Andrew,
a couple of quick responses to that. I think the first is that just as I talk about a winner-take-all economy, an increasing gulf between a tiny new elite and everybody else, and the hollowing out of the middle class, I think one of the consequences of technology is that's happening. There is a class, if you like, of global technologists and maybe of global executives who know how to use this technology, who are using it increasingly effectively, who no longer need secretaries, who no longer need middlemen. And so there is a small group of people who are using this technology to be incredibly productive. I know that I couldn't do probably 1% of what I do without the internet. I couldn't do the networking, the communication. So it worries me that there are certain people whose talent lend themselves towards taking advantage of this technology. And finally, on Keynes. You know, Keynes was the guy in the 20s, who warned about the impact of technology on employment. The point is, there'll always be people who say, oh, Keynes worried about it in the 20s, and look what happened. I mean, the reason why the original employment crisis of, again, we're in Berlin, I don't need to remind you of this, was the growth of fascism and then of war. So there was nothing inevitable about solving the first employment crisis of capitalism, and certainly the relationship or the great crisis of the 1920s and 1930s. And I worry today that we've had it so good for so long, and we've been so optimistic, particularly in the post-war boom, particularly in the period between 1945 and today, that we've forgotten the implications of long-term unemployment, on war, on the emergence of dictatorship. And I think it would be very unwise to simply assume that economists in the past have always predicted cataclysms and they've been wrong, so therefore they'll be wrong again. That's a bad logic.
We are unfortunately slowly running out of time, but I do want to take in a couple more questions before we do. Now, I have these gentlemen. Is there anyone?
Lady. We need ladies. I was at an event.
So that I'm not being.
Yeah, I was at an event a couple of days ago, and someone was outraged that there were no women questioners. So we need to have some.
Very good. Now, of course, I have to give you the word after this, but no, I was going to anyway. I just don't want to neglect anyone on that side. If there are no questions on that side, I would say we're taking in these 3 questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So we start with the gentleman. We'll move it over as a last question to the lady. Go ahead. And if I may ask you, keep it brief so we can get all the questions in.
Thank you for your great lack of optimism. I have one question
for our optimism or lack of optimism?
Lack of optimism, yes. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question to Mr. Rampling. I think the picture you drew about Google is mining data and you are selling only connectivity, it is a little bit maybe too simple, even unfair, because who is actually selling the traffic to Google traffic? It's telco, it's Telefónica also. When it goes over the Brooklyn Bridge or the Oakland Bridge or the Alexanderplatz, you are selling this data also. Is it not correct?
No, we're
it
not.
It comes from the cell phone.
Yeah, but we're not selling it to them. We're not selling it to them.
You make a gift then? No, I don't think so.
No, you choose that you wish to use a Google search engine or a Google operating system.
No, I mean the Google traffic. Where is Google the data getting from the traffic? It comes from the telcos, from the cell phone companies. Of course,
it doesn't come from us. It comes from the users.
Well, clearly there's a difference of opinion. Perhaps we can clear this in the
What means from the users?
Maybe
what do you think it comes? What is a user?
We're going to have a bilateral discussion here that's going to
go on. Once the data's out there, it's out the bottle, right? I mean, you can't control your data once it's being used.
No.
It's not, I mean, his point is it's not his anymore.
Yeah, it's your data.
But in the
It's
US,
what you do.
this phone company is selling
Google's,
this data.
whoever gets access to it.
It's not the only, the simple phone is selling the, is bringing the data. They sell this statistic traffic to Google. Believe me. Or you don't know it?
Okay. I don't get any money from Google for their Google Analytics tool.
But how they get the data for this traffic?
Because it's
not fair to say you sell a nice product and the other make the data mining. You are both together. You're working with our data. Yes.
Well, clearly you asked the question, he answered, you're not satisfied. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah.
There was no guarantee that all leave going to be, no customer is going to leave satisfied. That wasn't the guarantee here at the end of the evening. So clearly a difference of opinion, but you may take it up afterwards. Sure. I think Peter is going to be around for a while, so thank you. Go ahead, maybe another unsatisfied customer. Go ahead.
I will be short. Are the Asians smarter than the Europeans because they have their own services, their own search engines, their own messenger services?
The Asians. Well, the very brief response to that, Peter may have some ideas on it. There are two later. You wanted to say something? China is, again, it controls its market. Google would salivate over China, although they have behaved in some ways quite responsibly in terms of not caving into the demands of the Chinese government. But China is not an open market. Google is much stronger in Japan. I think, these American companies tend to do very well when there's a so-called free market, but when there's a nationalized market and either indigenous companies are government invested or supported or foreign companies are kept out, then it's much harder for Americans to compete on the same playing field. Which is why it's so hard in Europe, because Europe is a relatively open market, which is why American companies dominate. I
mean, I think the challenge is in terms of getting the right balance, because if you go to the extreme in terms of China's probably the best example, where you then get to a model which is about censorship, which again I don't believe in. So they're controlling the market, they're trying to manage their market, but then it goes the other way, which gets into censorship, and I don't fundamentally believe that should be censored. I don't think there's a perfect answer. I remember in the early days of the internet when lots of telco companies, we all tried to set up walled gardens. It was kind of like everything we were trying to control. We were trying to control access to information, into content, into entertainment, and it failed because fundamentally I don't think people want to be controlled in terms of what they can consume. And so opening up has got to be a good thing. But then, different markets, different opportunities. Do I think it's better that there's a controlled internet in China than no internet? Yeah, I think it's probably better that they've got some, even if it is controlled, if it is censored.
So we're going to end not just with one lady, but two. So two young ladies in the front row. Perhaps we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Yes, I have two questions, in fact. The first one goes back to regulations again. And I was wondering, just could you be a bit more precise and let's say if the German government or some German politicians would ask for your advice, would you recommend them to go for what should be their goal in Brussels, for instance? And I was also wondering whether I understood you correctly that the internet itself as a platform for economy and a new industry tends to monopolies.
Yeah.
And if I understood you correctly, could you elaborate a bit on that, why that is so?
I'll answer your second part of your question first. I mean, a lot of my book's about it, but it's essentially the network effect, which means that when you get ahead, it's very, very hard to catch up. So, for example, with Google essentially mined the intelligence of the internet. It was a very audacious move in 1998, 1999. It trawled the entire internet and collected its collective intelligence and built a really clever search engine. And the intelligence of that search engine has compounded itself, which makes it almost impossible to build an equivalently intelligent search engine. Microsoft has invested billions of dollars in Bing, and it's a failure. The same is true of Facebook. How would you keep up with Facebook? There's 1.2 billion people are on it. And the value of Facebook is in those 1.2 billion people, is in their control of people's attention, is in the links, is in the Facebook pages. So it's very, very hard. You know, again, in a sense, I guess they're a click away, but that click is never really realizable. So it's the network effect. It's a very ironic consequence, since the network is open, since the network is distributed. And that's one of the paradoxes that I point out in the book, is that the more distributed, the more open the network, the more it lends itself to a winner-take-all economy, which means that the traditional moral criteria we use of good and evil aren't relevant. It's a structural consequence. In terms of your first part of your question, let me say, I would, if the government, if the Brussels or Berlin came to me, I would say pursue the antitrust thing aggressively, recognize that Google's strength now is anti-competition, look at the way in which companies like Yelp in the US are deeply troubled by Google's anti-competitive strategy. I think there is a need for a data protection law. Now, whether it's the law of forgetting, I'm not sure. The logistics of the law of forgetting are problematic in some ways, but there needs to be laws of forgetting. And I think you need traditional regulation in the internet. No internet companies should be independent of laws. Uber should be as you know, laws should be as relevant to Uber as they are to the traditional economy. The new economy shouldn't be able to exist beyond laws. And let me, since I'm on the regulation issue, let me say that some laws don't work. So, for example, there is a law I think that's been passed in Spain and France, suggesting that Google should pay newspapers every time they send them a visitor. I think that's one of the most absurd laws I've ever heard. Google is doing these newspapers a favor by sending them traffic. And indeed, Google has responded by saying, well, if that's the case, we're coming out of those markets. So Google News has been shut, I think, in Spain and France. So not all laws work. Some laws are bad. And I'm as critical of Google as anyone, but I don't believe that all anti-Google legislation is a good thing.
Well, that
just on the regulation, there's two extra things I'd add to Andrew's list, and I agree with all of his. The two simple wish lists would be to say, have regulation and make sure the people who are operating in the same space have the same regulation. So if you want to do messaging services in Germany, then you should be regulated in the same way that the incumbents in Germany are regulated to deliver messaging services. So then you have a fair playing field. That would be the first thing on my shopping list. The second thing would be to break down the monopolies that prevent me to move my data. I want to move my pictures, my music, my contacts, my string of texts. I want to be able to move them from one operating system to another. So force open APIs across operating systems, across devices, and so on.
Okay, clearly you just won over a fan. So that's
yes,
that's great. Makes up for
but
this.
That may
that's
require
a free beer for you, okay?
But that may require changes in the business model of these companies too.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have the last question from this young lady here, and then we're going to wrap it up. Go ahead.
I've got a question. You said that you want to change the laws and like the ways the internet works, but like in every state the laws are different. So, but the internet is worldwide. How do you do that? I mean, if even one country changed the laws for the internet, and I don't know however it would do it, but stop cyberbullying, how would that be in different countries? I mean, every country is different.
Well, that's a great final.
Sorry, you said the internet isn't the answer, but for what? Like, for what is?
Well,
yeah, for what question? For what is it not the answer?
Well, as I said, the internet's not the solution. It's not, and we talked a lot about this tonight. It's not working as the operating system for network life. But in terms of your first question, and this may be an appropriate summary, there was a dream at the beginning, particularly people like Tim Berners-Lee and many of the other people who built the internet. that this would be truly global, that it would replace nation states, that it would cross boundaries, that it would create one world, that finally we would live in what McLuhan called a global village. This was something I've talked about in my book. That hasn't happened. One of the ironic consequences of the internet, actually, is the closing of boundaries. So we have a Chinese internet, we have a Russian internet, we have an Iranian internet, we may eventually have a European internet. In some ways, we have an American internet. Now, some people might say, well, that's a bad thing. I wish it wasn't the case. And I think I would agree with you. But the reality of the world today is not of a global digital community. It's of a series of communities. So when it comes to bullying, I think I would argue that the most effective way of dealing with bullying is at the national level. Now, I'm no great fan of, as Peter has suggested, of some of the censorious nature of Chinese internet policy. But I'm guessing that the Chinese are probably relatively responsible when it comes to online bullying. And the nation state has always been a relatively effective vehicle for dealing with things like, crime, bullying, and many of the other criminal activities online. So I think the best defense against bullying is probably at a national level. It doesn't mean it's always effective, and that doesn't mean I support, Iranian policy of chopping off bullies' hands and that sort of thing. But we've got to come to terms with the reality of digital society, which is it reflects national sovereignty. It reflects 21st century nation states. It doesn't replace them.
Well, I think the internet is not the answer, and yeah, exactly, indeed, to which question. But I think Andrew Keen laid out, you don't have to agree with everything, but he's certainly passionate. I think that one is for sure. And we started out the discussion by asking you first, by asking the audience, which one of you actually thinks that the internet so far has been mostly a disaster? One brave woman there raised her hand. 90 minutes later, who agrees with Andrew Keen? The internet has been mostly a disaster. Andrew, you got to come back.
There you go.
One, two,
she's
three,
shy.
four.
You believe her? Two,
We've got half vote over here.
Wow, Andrew. Look at that. Two more over there.
Oh my God.
And, well, the gentleman
I should go into politics.
I'm telling you. Well, I can say for certain the premiere of the Digital Masterminds, I think, was a full success. And both gentlemen, I think, do this title justice. And in that regard, I want to thank both Peter Rampling and, of course, Andrew Keen for a riveting discussion. Thank you. This has been great.
Great job.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And now, of course, Andrew Keen will stick around your flight until for San Francisco doesn't leave tonight, so that's a good thing. Going to be around. Your book is there, can be signed, obviously. You're going to be around for a couple more questions. So is Peter, and for the rest of you, mingle, network. That's what Basecamp is here for. And thank you for your attention. Thank you.